Joe Biden, for 50 years, he was just a fixture in Washington, right? His journey was this incredible mix of huge political ambition and just profound personal tragedy. And it all led to a single historic term as president. So, how did such a long road end in such a dramatic way? Let's get into it.
So, let's start at the very end of that road, the White House. Here he is, Joe Biden as the 46th president. This was the culmination of a lifelong dream. And get this, at 78 years old, he made history as the oldest person to ever take that oath.
But the presidency itself is really just the final chapter in a much, much longer story. To really get it, you've got to look at the 50 years that came before. So that brings us to our big question. What were the key moments, the triumphs and the tragedies, that really defined his path to that one historic term?
Now, that path didn't start with some big presidential campaign. Nope. It started on the long road from Delaware to Washington, D.C., where for 36 years, he was simply known as Senator Biden.
Okay, this timeline really puts his career into perspective. He shows up in the Senate in 1973, and he's just a kid, really, only 30 years old. By 1987, he's chairing the Judiciary Committee. That's a huge deal. You see his legislative fingerprints on the 1994 crime bill, and you see his foreign policy chops with the 2002 Iraq war vote. The point is, for more than 3 decades, he wasn't just in Washington, he was a central player, building this reputation as a moderate who could work with both sides.
But man, his record is complicated. And nothing shows that more than the 94 crime bill. On one hand, it included the Violence Against Women Act, which he always said was his proudest achievement. But on the other hand, that very same bill has been slammed for helping fuel mass incarceration, something Biden himself would later express regret about. It's a perfect snapshot of the kind of dual legacy he built in the Senate.
But here's the thing. You just can't understand Joe Biden, the politician, without understanding his personal story. Because running parallel to his rise in Washington was this recurring theme of just unbelievable loss. And it shaped absolutely everything.
I mean, imagine this. It's 1972. He just won his first Senate election. He's on top of the world. And just weeks later, the unthinkable happens. A car crash kills his wife, Nelia, and their baby daughter, Naomi. His 2 young sons, Bo and Hunter, were seriously hurt. The loss was so crushing, he almost resigned from the Senate before he was even sworn in.
And this cycle of ambition and setback really became the story of his pursuit of the presidency. His first try in 1988, it completely imploded because of a plagiarism scandal. 20 years later, in 2008, he tries again, but just can't compete with political forces like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Then, just as he's thinking about a 2016 run, tragedy hits again. His son, Bo, dies from brain cancer. It really seemed like the door to the White House was closed for good.
A huge turning point came when he met Jill Jacobs. After everything he'd been through, he often said it was Jill who put him back together. She's credited with renewing his interest not just in life, but in politics too.
And that renewed focus eventually put him right back on the national stage. Not as the presidential nominee, but as the second in command.
So, after his own 2008 campaign fizzled out, his rival, Barack Obama, picked him as his running mate. It made perfect sense. Obama needed Biden's decades of foreign policy know-how and his connection to working-class voters. But what started as a political calculation, as you can see here, turned into one of the most famous bromances in Washington and a genuinely close partnership.
And he was no figurehead. Obama gave him serious work. He was in charge of the huge 2009 stimulus package. He was the point man for drawing down the war in Iraq. And when Washington was on the verge of an economic meltdown during the debt ceiling and fiscal cliff fights, it was Biden, with all his Senate connections, who was sent in to cut the deals.
All of that experience, the Senate, the tragedies, the vice presidency, it all led him back to his ultimate goal. In 2020, on his 3rd attempt, he finally won the presidency. But his one term in office turned out to be a complete whirlwind, defined by huge legislative wins and overwhelming crises, all at the same time.
On the home front, he went big. He passed 3 massive laws. First, the American Rescue Plan, a nearly $2 trillion stimulus to fight the pandemic's economic fallout. Then came a rare bipartisan victory, a $1 trillion Infrastructure Act. And finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, a huge bill that tackled climate change and healthcare costs. But his term was also marked by some enormous challenges. As you can see from this chart, apprehensions at the southern border just surged to historic levels. It became a persistent political and humanitarian crisis that was a constant issue for his administration.
And then, on the world stage, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 was an absolutely defining moment. This picture from the Situation Room just captures the tension as Kabul fell to the Taliban. The way the exit was handled drew sharp criticism from both parties and really damaged his administration's reputation for competence. And then, of course, there was the economy. Inflation, which had been basically gone for decades, came roaring back, hitting 40-year highs. For millions of Americans, the rising cost of gas, groceries, everything became a daily frustration. And as you'd expect, it took a heavy toll on his approval ratings.
Despite all these headwinds, he decided to run for re-election. But everything changed after that first presidential debate. His shaky performance just poured gasoline on all the simmering concerns about his age and health. The pressure, even from within his own party, became a firestorm. And then he did something you almost never see in modern politics. The sitting president withdrew from the race.
His withdrawal set the stage for a final chapter that would become one of the most controversial of his entire career. And it all centered on one of the president's ultimate powers, the power to pardon. The most stunning move was this: a full and unconditional pardon for his son Hunter, which covered a decade of potential federal crimes. This was a dramatic reversal from a promise he had made over and over on the campaign trail that he would not use his power to protect his own family. But the pardon for his son was just the beginning. His final acts of clemency were described as unprecedented, not just because of who he pardoned, but because of the sheer size of the list. I mean, look at this list. In his final days, he issued these sweeping, preemptive pardons to his siblings, to top officials like General Mark Milley and Dr. Anthony Fauci, and even to the members of the January 6th committee. His justification? He said he was protecting them from what he called politically motivated investigations by the next administration. And so the long journey comes to an end. It was a career defined by persistence through unimaginable tragedy, decades of shaping policy, and a brief, turbulent time with immense power. His story's been written, but the big question remains: how will history remember him? For the laws he passed, the crises he navigated, or for the final, controversial way he chose to leave the stage?